Hi guys, this is Dr. Sadasivam once again with you, and today we're going to talk about the borrowing plan of the government. Remember when the budget was announced, our finance minister talked about how we are going to source the expenses of government of India for the next 1 year, and which amounts to 15 lakh crores. That is nothing short of 15 trillion rupees. And whenever you talk in such terms, there's one important factor we need to keep in mind. How much of it is a percentage of overall GDP, which is the gross domestic product? And that is approximately 6.5%, guys. There was a time when any fiscal deficit above 3% was supposed to be very, very risky. But today we are at 6.5% fiscal deficit. But in spite of that, we are very confident that we will be able to pull through. Right? We're going to talk a little bit about that. Now, let's go back in time 2 years back when we faced the first wave of COVID. I'm talking about March 2020. The government did the same thing. You know what the government did was it put in place a slew of measures that could inject liquidity into the system, as a result of which we have been able to pull through the whole of COVID pandemic quite successfully. But today in this session, we're going to talk about how different the current borrowing plan is in comparison to the earlier borrowing plan in March 2020, just after the first wave of COVID. That's what we're going to talk about. This is going to be a lot different. The borrowing plan of the government, especially as announced in the last year budget, is going to be very, very different from the one we did 2 years back during the COVID period. If you remember, during March 2020, RBI had made it cheaper for the government to borrow. How? By lowering the repo rates. Let me explain to you what is repo rates. I'm sure a lot of economic students they may be going through this video. Let me explain to non-economic students, right? Repo rate is the interest rate with which the RBI lends money to the respective banks in the country. Your PNB, your HDFC, whatever these banks are, that's the rate. And what is repo reverse rate? Because we will be using these terms more often in this lecture. And reverse repo rate is the interest rate with which the other banks park their funds with Reserve Bank of India. That's the reverse repo rate. And generally speaking, the reverse repo rate will be slightly lower than the repo rates, which typically means that the RBI will lend its money at a higher rate to the banks, but when the banks want to park their money with the Reserve Bank, they will be borrowing that money at a lesser rate, which is called as the reverse repo rate. I wanted to make a small explanation because these are terms we will be repeatedly using in this video. Right? Okay, now coming back to the old story, in March 2020, the RBI bought immense quantity of bonds from the government of India. So by doing which, what happens? A lot of liquidity is injected into the system. The RBI injects liquidity into the system, right? Which means typically liquidity into the system is hardcore money into the system. We have various forms. You have M1, M2, M3 money supply, but all that becomes a very complex macroeconomic subject, so we will not dive deep into all those. But those of you who are interested in knowing what is M1, M2, M3 kinds of money supply, you can browse through my other videos, subscribe to this channel, and then get to know what each of those terms are, because that's for hardcore economics guys, people who are taking up economics as an optional subject in the IAS mains. For such kind of guys, that would be useful, but for generic kind of guys who will use it for discussions here and there, for those who want to keep themselves abreast of current affairs, etc., this explanation is more than enough in terms of what is repo, what is reverse repo, and what is injection of liquidity, and some common terms which are used in daily parlance. Now, what happens when you inject liquidity into the system? What does it mean? Injecting liquidity into the system means you are putting more rupee into the system. The money in circulation increases. So when the money in circulation increases, logically what happens? You have too much money chasing too few goods. So what happens when too much money is chasing too few goods? Yes, those of you who thought it as inflation, you're right. Remember when we were children, people used to ask, if there is so much of money problem in the country, why doesn't the government print notes? That's a normal question. We used to ask when we were children, right? But the government can't do that, because when you print more and more money, the money in circulation increases, and that will give rise to inflation. And inflation, hyperinflation. We have heard stories of how in countries like Zimbabwe, even Germany at one point of time, Argentina, Brazil at various periods in time, the inflation reached such a level. We're talking about hyperinflation. A loaf of bread will cost 20 lakh rupees. A loaf of bread, guys. And to buy a loaf of bread, you have to carry gunny bags of currency to the shop, right? That's exactly what happens when the liquidity into the system goes over a certain limit. Therefore, the government has to control the supply of money, and the government has various levers in its control. Something like a bus driver, when he drives, he has got a lever in his hand: first gear, second gear, third gear, fourth gear. When the bus is going up the hill, he lowers down the gear to first gear, and when it's going on the highway, he cruises at a speed of 120 kilometers per hour, and he puts the gear in the fifth gear, right? So depending on the situation, much like how a driver controls the levers of the bus, the Reserve Bank of India has certain levers under its control through which it is able to control the circulation of money in the country, right? So interest rate is one thing. This way they are able to control the inflation, check the inflation. But inflation and growth have a direct correlation, because whenever you try to control the inflation too much and bring it down to 3% and 2%, then what happens? Growth suffers. So the government has to do that acrobatic work. They have to balance. Judicious kind of a balancing is required, guys, and that is why economics is a very complex subject, right? We will come to that little later. So what we are typically talking about is, during the COVID period, the Reserve Banks of India injected a lot of liquidity into the system. Typically means putting money in the hands of people. So when there is money in the hands of people, people spend that money, right? Okay. So when more money, liquidity is injected in the system, it results in inflation. We have already studied that. But that was kind of a controlled inflation. Why was it controlled? Because it was a pandemic induced inflation. Pandemic induced inflation typically means there was a climate of uncertainty everywhere. The banks were reluctant to lend money. The households are not interested in spending the money because they were not very sure about the future salaries coming, right? And firms also were not making huge capital investments because there was huge uncertainty at that point in time. First wave, second wave. It was like we have never experienced this kind of a pandemic ever in the past, and all of us have gone through that, and we all know what kind of a life we had to go through during those critical moments. I'm talking about March, April, May, June of 2020. So spending was also kept under check. But since the liquidity came, liquidity was injected into the system by various slew of measures, both by the Government of India as well as by the Reserve Bank of India. Inflation did take place, but it did not spin out of control, right? Therefore, as a result, the government could run large, huge fiscal deficits without worrying much about inflations. Moreover, please note this point. Capital flow from rich countries to emerging markets also provided the liquidity. What does it mean? Rich countries, there was so much of money, and that money was coming into the emerging markets. So typically when we talk about India, India is also considered to be an emerging market, especially when we talk about capital markets throughout the world. So those money also started coming. Foreign institutional investors typically we are talking.